I'm joined in the studio by Emanuel Pastreich. Emanuel is a critic of literature, technology policy and international relations, and he's currently a professor at Kyung-hee University in Seoul. He studied Chinese at Yale University and received an MA in comparative literature at the University of Tokyo, where he actually did all his coursework in Japanese. He completed his PhD at Harvard University, and he's written extensively about Korean culture in a series of books, which we will discuss this evening. Professor Pastreich, I'm overjoyed to have you in the studio this evening. Thanks for coming in.
As am I. Thanks as always, Barry.
Well, it's always great to see you. But let's just talk about your background and introduce yourself a little to begin with. So can you tell us who you are and what you do?
Who I am? Well, that's an ontological question maybe beyond me. So I guess I'm an American. I grew up in the Midwest, and along the way, became very interested in Asia in college. And I was a literature professor at University of Illinois for many years. But lately I've been drawn to see that culture is the essence, the essential issue. I mean, so that issues in technology, foreign policy, environment, they all come back. Culture is what binds them all together. So we've been trying at our Asia Institute and in things I've written to sort of say, you know, we want to deal with these issues. Let's come back to the sort of cultural foundations.
And this is what you write about all the time, isn't it? Culture.
Yeah. So I started in classical literature. So my original work was 17th, 18th century Chinese, Japanese, and Korean novels. That was my original field. But I have expanded to look at technology, but not as a, expert in technology per se, but like how does technology affect our society?
You mentioned there as well the Asia Institute. Can you tell us about your involvement with the Asia Institute and what it is?
So we started the Asia Institute back in 2007 when I was in Daejeon, which has become sort of my home, my gohyang in Korea. And we wanted to put together an institute that was a think tank, but talked about some of the issues that haven't really been touched upon. Things like how technology impacts our lives, our society, how environmental issues are impacting us now increasingly, and also to think about international relations, not just as like a bunch of diplomats meeting, but the question of how our countries are connected by trade, how energy and culture and other factors affect the way in which individuals, countries, cities, local districts are starting to interact with each other, and finally to talk with young people about these issues and talk about which direction should we go, what can we make. And particularly in Asia.
Well, I know that you spend a lot of time working on the Asia Institute, but I know over the past few years you've also written a lot. You've written extensively about Korea. Can you tell me, when did you first become engaged with Korean culture? When did you first start writing about it?
Right. So my field was Japanese literature. As you know, like Robert Fauser, Japan was my thing. Along the way, when I taught at University of Illinois, Koreans would just come up to me and they say, let's do this or let's do that. And so I became more involved with Koreans, and I was originally doing comparative studies, so Korea was part of it. I don't think I intended to go into Korean studies per se, and in some ways I'm not technically a Korean studies person. But I was compelled by, there's a certain sort of passion and excitement and this combination of both imagination and sincere sort of feelings that you get from many Koreans that just sort of inevitably leads you to think more seriously about what Korea is.
Well, you started by writing about a famous Korean writer, didn't you? It was Park Ji-won?
Correct.
That was your first book about Korean culture, was on a translation of his novels?
Right. So that's the first book first thing I actually published as a book, right? So I translated 10 of his novels, and the idea there was that in the West, I hate that word, but we use it anyway. I mean, people really don't know Korea, and don't get Nobel prizes for literature. But one of the issues behind all that is that the classical tradition of Korea has just not been translated, and so I thought. Park Ji-won is an extremely interesting novelist. He has a very sort of fascinating, ironic approach to his writings, and I think if translated well, I don't know how well I did, but it has the potential to really engage intellectuals, readers around the world. So it was really important to me to get that book out.
And that's from the Choson period, right? His works are...
Right. 1760s, 1770s.
Yeah. What was it like diving into that period and researching it and translating those works?
Yeah, well, so I had started that on that track back in my dissertation, but it was fascinating. I mean, there's an enormous amount of depth in the Choson period. We sort of forgotten a little bit about it, but it was extremely complicated, sophisticated society. And Park Ji-won is unique as a writer because he often takes sort of overlooked characters, beggars, poor farmers, day workers, and he makes them the protagonists of his stories. So he's sort of showing you Chosun society from the bottom up,
really?
Looking up, or looking across, and you find this incredible sort of depth in that society at that time. And I think that maybe also influenced me to say, look at Korea today also, to say that that Korea, as you probably know, the first impression of Korea often is it seems a little bit bland and predictable. But if you spend a little bit of time and you start to explore it and you look at it, you start to talk to people, you realize that there's just this incredible depth there for those who sort of take the plunge. But if you don't take the plunge, right, then you'll just see, very uniform apartment buildings and, coffee shops. But there's something there waiting for you in Korea. And I saw that in Park Ji-won's novels. And I've continued to be very excited about the potential in Korea.
And well, straight after writing about Park Ji-won and the Choson period, you took the plunge and you started writing about it. Your next work has a great title. The English title is Life is a Matter of Direction, Not of Speed, Records of a Robinson Crusoe in Korea.
Right.
Can you introduce that work a little bit and tell us what it dealt with?
So that was sort of going off the deep end. So I was an academic. I wrote 2 books on sort of scholarly topics, but that was more about, in some way, my own experience, why I came to Korea, what I think as an American I was looking for in Asia, and what I found here in terms of a certain sort of depth of experience. I mentioned, for example, in that book, the story of the dream I had when I went to Haein Sa Temple, and that's it's a little story, but I think it's worth telling. I had a dream. I went there on New Year's night. I fell asleep, and I had a very intense dream. In the dream, I was looking for my grandmother. I couldn't find her anywhere in her apartment building, and I was despairing. I mean, and then suddenly my grandmother, I found her, and she was carrying a bunch of shopping bags, and I hugged her, and I woke up immediately. And what haunted me about the dream was that my grandmother, as she appeared in my dream, was like in her 80s, right? But my grandmother had died when she was like 59.
I see.
So she was, in the dream, as she came out, she was the age that my grandmother would have been if she'd still been alive. So after that dream, this was in 1995, suddenly I felt some sort of a bond with Korea. I never could really explain it, but that sort of thing is what I talked about in that book, this very personal experience of Korea for me.
How did the Korean readers respond? Did you find any interesting comments or responses?
Yeah, well, I mean, some people actually liked that story. I wouldn't say that I should put a footnote, a qualification and say that my 3 books in Korean, Koreans don't always like the sections that I like the most, right? They're sometimes drawn to slightly different things. So, for example, the fact that I use a Korean name, Emanuel, this is something Koreans are fascinated with, and they always mention it. I actually don't think it's such an important issue. There are other things that seem much more important to me. So mine is a idiosyncratic, perspective on Korea. But I'm on all 3 books, so I got a pretty good response from people. The first book was more aimed, I think, at young people. It was sort of more free form. Not as well edited, not as polished, but some people like that, right? I mean, they appreciate something which is a little bit rough, and you could see in some parts, some of my own. I mean, of course, it was edited in the final, drafts, but you could see that I wasn't always the greatest writer of Korean, and I had some misunderstandings and there were errors in it. So the second book which was the Scholars, what's the title?
Well, yeah, this was the book you published last year. The Scholars of the World Speak Out About Korea's Future. So can you maybe mention, who did you speak to? You spoke to some really incredible people.
Right, so that was based on a series of seminars we did with Asia Institute. It included people like Noam Chomsky and Francis Fukuyama, Benjamin Barber, who I think as a result of that seminar became very interested in Korea and came here twice. And started working with the city of Seoul. John Huntsman, who was the ambassador to China previously, and basically, and a bunch of experts in other fields as well.
Sure, yeah.
And the idea was to take people who were not necessarily Korea experts and pose to them some of the issues in Korea and say, well, basically, what's your perspective on this? How does this relate to things that maybe Koreans haven't thought about? You know, how things happening, for example, in Korea are similar to things happening in Ireland. We have a whole section there on with an Irish scholar of education, for example, or in Germany, right? Welfare issues in Germany and in Korea. And so some of those, the sort of the highlights, were selected and translated into Korean, and we published it as a book, which got a pretty good response. Very different kind of book, though.
Yeah. Were there? So you mentioned like Chomsky and Fukuyama. Can you remember? Were there any particular highlights or any particularly salient issues they addressed?
Well, in the case of Chomsky, we talked about media. This is media, and he basically. He was very positive about Korean media. He felt there was a great amount of diversity. I should say, it's not as if Chomsky is reading, Korean media every day.
Sure.
I explained to him, or we explained to him a bit about what's happening in the media in Korea, the diversity, some of the issues and controversies in media. And his response was to say that this seemed quite vital. And he was very impressed by that. A lot of people liked that particular section. Because Koreans don't always get proper credit for what they do. I mean, Korea has a very vital. I mean, as you know from your own show. I mean, I can tell you, I couldn't do this in the United States. I mean, it's really a unique environment, and many Koreans are not aware. They think, oh, well, there's some advanced country out there that has this great media, right? Or like subways. Seoul Metro is probably one of the best run, most professional, and most artistic subway systems in the whole world, and has great clean bathrooms.
I fully agree.
And yet Koreans are not aware that this is probably the best metro system in the world. They think, oh, well, somewhere in some advanced country, there's no, there's no advanced country out there. This is the best. So we did a lot of that sort of explaining. In the case of Fukuyama, we talked about An Chosu and the question of, alternative or sort of dark horse candidates and this is now ancient history from the last election. And he gave some perspectives on America and some comparisons, which were very interesting to say between, how An Chosu's role is and other people in say, in the United States who've also played a sort of similar political role.
Okay. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that Korean people are sometimes oblivious to the good aspects of their culture, because that's what you focused on in your book published this year. And it had another really interesting title. It's A Different Republic of Korea About Which Only Koreans Are Ignorant. So can you explain the title and tell us what aren't Koreans themselves aware of about culture here? Well,
I'm sure you're aware of this phenomenon that, as I said about Seoul Metro or other cases like that, the title being 한국인만 모르는 대한민국. And we talked a lot about what it is that really makes Korea unique and inspiring, and particularly what in Korean culture, habits, systems, governance could be sort of a global standard. Not just that Korea is doing it well, but that other countries could learn from Korea, which I think is very, very true. And some of them are very sort of, we talk about literature, for example, why Korean literature is not all that well known overseas, what it would take to sort of increase its profile and make people more aware of Korean literature, how to translate it, how to inspire people. But we also talked a lot, I wrote a lot about the question of the traditional Korea, right? And this is often been a sort of a blank spot, right? And that you have this modern Korea, Gangnam style, but the question is, where was Korea before 1960, right? And many people overseas have the impression that it didn't exist, right? It suddenly sprung out of nowhere, with Samsung and Hyundai. I don't think that's true. Second, even more importantly, there's an enormous amount of cultural sort of content out there that's just waiting for us to discover it and make it sort of part of global heritage, global cultural heritage.
Well, that idea, that's a consistent theme in your work, isn't it? So I know that you're passionate about reevaluating, more traditional Korean culture. Can you explain what's your motivation behind that urge?
Well, the motivation, I would say, is larger than just Korea. Right? There's a book by Jared Diamond, his famous anthropologist at UCLA. He wrote recently called The Way We Lived Until Yesterday, I believe is the title, talks about all the wisdom and expertise, technology, know-how that traditional societies have, which we've lost, but that we could perhaps regain. And that's a global issue. It has to do with the whole concept of modernity. And as we move sort of past modernity, we're getting to a point in our evolution where suddenly that wisdom of the past is calling out to us. And then we focus here specifically on Korea, and we say, for example, they're Koreans, they want to have like a ecologically friendly Seoul, city of Seoul. So they go to, Germany or to Finland or Sweden and take pictures of eco-cities there, and they come back and they present and say, well, look at all these great advanced countries and their eco-cities. Well, if you're looking for an eco-city, Seoul itself, Hanyang, up until the 20th century, was one of the best-run eco-cities in the world. Extremely careful control of the environment, what they call sort of the geomancy or pungsu. Now it's become something for like how you design your grave so you'll be rich. But in fact, it was ecology, right? It was nothing to do, I wouldn't say nothing to do, but it wasn't just about, taking care of your ancestors, but rather how does the water flow? How does the wind blow? What's the relationship of land and water in your environment? And so that wisdom, Seoul also had almost complete 100% recycling, had extremely efficient organic farming. And there's a famous scholar from the United States, I think E.J. King, who visited Korea and China and Japan in 1911. He wrote a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries, in which he talked at how incredibly effective this high-density, high-efficiency organic farming in Korea was, and also how it didn't create the problems that the United States has, or other countries now, thanks to the United States, of losing topsoil, right? So they preserve topsoil. This may seem like a minor little detail, but it's extremely serious question of loss of topsoil. And that expertise is just waiting for us in the past.
Well, those are interesting facts, and I know that you've returned to these ideas time and again in your books, but how do you think Korea can actually take more advantage of this wisdom from the past? What can they do?
Right. I wrote an article recently on the annals, the veritable annals of the Chosun dynasty. This is the Chosun Wangjo Shillok. And this was the system in the government in which essentially part of the government would make records, right, of what happened in politics and in the with the people around the king, the Wang, and they would preserve them. And these records were incredibly accurate. And they were a very, very good system, right? And the most important part of them, first is just accurate information about what's happening. But the most important part of them was that all the kings and their high officials knew that there were these records, which are going to be preserved, and they were for 500 years, that they would be judged by history, right? Not tomorrow's headline or next election, right? But where would their status be in 100 years? And I thought that was really inspiring, that tradition. So could you go back to that? No. You'd have to totally reinvent it. But I guess we're thinking in that sort of Renaissance sense, right? As we talked the other day. So the Renaissance, which took place in the 15th century, the central figures would say something like, oh, let's go back to Greece and Rome. But if you look at, say, what Michelangelo did or other people say with things like the Sistine Chapel, it's definitely not going back to Rome. It's doing something totally original, something unprecedented. But that act of sort of going back to the past for inspiration and for confidence and sort of inspiration, really. And then going forward and creating something truly new and original, I think that's the respect in which Korea's past is so valuable.
Okay. Emanuel, what I've noticed that's a common theme across all your work is your optimism about Korea's future. Can you tell us, why are you so optimistic?
Obviously, as you know in communications, optimism is much preferable than pessimism. So I think it's maybe good to put a footnote in and say, I'm assuming, I feel strongly that Korea could be this sort of a country. It could be inspiring culturally. It could be a center for a new renaissance. But I'm not guaranteeing that it will be, right? In a way, this is posing a challenge to our listeners, to Koreans, and people here in Korea, to say Korea has this potential in it. But whether we realize it it's really up to us. Really up to us.
Okay, well, that's a great message for us to end the interview on today, Professor Pastreich. I could talk to you all day. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, well, and one last thing though, you've chosen a song for us to close the show out tonight. Can you introduce it?
Okay, so I'm going to have a song by a band called Japangi Coffee Shop, which is something like the coffee dispenser coffee shop. It's a local indie band in Daejeon. I enjoyed they have only one album out, but I've gone to their concerts with my daughter, who was in first grade at the time. And they have a wonderful sort of style, I think. Very sort of relaxed, very attractive. I think their album, if you have a chance to get it, you can. And if you get down to Taeungdong in Daejeon, you can hear this song, 사랑이랑, from them directly with one of their little concerts. And this is the part of Korea. I mean, I love Gangnam Style, but this is really what we should be looking for in Korea.
All right, excellent. Well, I can't wait to listen to it. Emanuel, once again, thanks for coming in. And thank you all for joining me today.